There is a village in Newfoundland accessible only by boat. No roads lead in. The population is 85. Icebergs drift past in spring. Whales breach in the harbor. Tourists number in dozens annually. The village has been here for 200 years. This is Newfoundland Outport life. Scattered along this island's coastline are communities most Canadians have never heard of. Places where boats matter more than cars. Where the ocean dictates everything. Where isolation preserved culture that modernization destroyed elsewhere. Most visitors see St. John's, Gros Morne, maybe the Viking settlement. They miss the Outports, the real Newfoundland, the communities that stayed when resettlement programs tried to move them. We found 8 outports representing Newfoundland as it actually exists rather than as tourism markets it. Number 8. Grand Brute. Grand Brute sits on Newfoundland's south coast, population 0. This outport was resettled in 2010 when the last residents accepted government relocation packages. But the village still stands. Grand Brute is accessible only by boat. No road ever reached here. The government ferry stopped when resettlement completed. Now the village sits empty except for occasional visitors and former residents who return in summer. Average house price. Properties are essentially abandoned. Occasional sales happen privately for minimal amounts. Walking Grand Brute means experiencing outport architecture without people. The houses are saltbox Newfoundland. The stages jut over water. The setting is beautiful, but the absence is haunting. Why nobody visits? No ferry service operates? You need private boat or chartered access. The village is empty. The reality? Grand Brute represents what happens when isolation becomes unsustainable. Number 7. Little Bay Islands. Little Bay Islands sits off Newfoundland's northeast coast, population around 30. This outport is an active resettlement process. The government offered relocation packages in 2019. Most residents accepted. The village is accessible by ferry from Pilley's Island. The ferry still runs because people still live here. Average house price, $45,000. Properties sell for almost nothing. A house sold recently for $38,000. The school closed. The clinic closed. Services that made year-round living viable have disappeared. The residents who remain do so out of attachment rather than practicality. Why nobody visits? The community is too small to support tourism. The resettlement process creates atmosphere of ending. The reality: this outport is dying slowly. The residents who stay know this. They stay anyway because leaving means losing something irreplaceable. Number 6. Salvage sits on the Eastport Peninsula. Population around 150. This outport is accessible by road, but the road is long. Getting here requires commitment. The village sits on a harbor surrounded by hills. Fishing stages line the waterfront. Boats still work from this harbor. Average house price, $125,000. A 3-bedroom house sold recently for $118,000. Salvage has maintained character because tourists rarely come. The road exists, but distance from major routes keeps traffic minimal. The harbor is one of Newfoundland's most picturesque. The setting rivals famous tourist areas, but Salvage stays quiet. Why nobody visits? Too far from tourist routes. No hotels, no restaurants for visitors. The consideration: Salvage proves road access does not automatically mean tourist invasion. Number 5. Rose Blanche. Rose Blanche sits on Newfoundland's southwest coast, population around 500. The lighthouse at Rose Blanche is one of Newfoundland's most photographed, but few explore the village. The outport is accessible by road. The lighthouse brings some visitors, but most come, photograph, and leave. Average house price, $145,000. A house near the harbor sold for $137,000. Rose Blanche has fishing heritage dating back centuries. The harbor still works, boats still go out. The coastline is dramatic. The lighthouse sits on cliffs above the ocean, but the village itself is authentic working outport. Why nobody visits? People visit the lighthouse. They rarely explore Rose Blanche as a community. The consideration: Rose Blanche shows how outport character can survive limited tourism. Number 4. Conche. Conche sits on Newfoundland's northern peninsula, population around 200. This is French shore territory. The village was settled by French fishermen. Conche is accessible by road, but the road is long. The village sits far from major routes. Getting here requires hours of driving. Average house price, $115,000. A house with harbor views sold for $108,000. Conche has a French heritage museum. The village maintains connections to French fishing history. But tourism is minimal. The harbor is beautiful. The coastline is dramatic. But Conche stays quiet because reaching it requires commitment. Why nobody visits. Too far from everything. The northern peninsula brings tourists to Gros Morne and the Viking site. Conche is hours beyond those on narrowing roads. The consideration, Conche's remoteness is its defining characteristic. Number 3, Change Islands. Change Island sits off Fogo Island, population around 200. This outport is accessible by ferry from Farewell. The ferry runs regularly but requires planning. Change Islands has arguably the most intact traditional outport architecture in Newfoundland. The village looks like mid-20th century Newfoundland because it is. Average house price $95,000. A traditional house sold recently for $87,000. The village has no tourist infrastructure, no hotels, no restaurants. The lack of commercial tourism keeps it authentic. Walking Change Islands means experiencing outport life as it existed before roads and cars dominated. Why nobody visits? Change Islands sits in Fogo Island's shadow. Fogo got famous. Fogo got the luxury inn. Change Islands stayed overlooked. The consideration, Change Islands is what Fogo Island was before the inn. Number 2, Ramea sits on islands off Newfoundland's south coast. Population around 400. This outport is accessible only by ferry from Burgeo. The ferry runs daily, but weather cancels crossings regularly. Ramea spreads across several islands connected by causeways. The ocean surrounds everything. The isolation is genuine. Average house price, $125,000. A house with ocean views sold for $119,000. Ramea has maintained fishing economy. The fish plant still operates. Boats still work from the harbor. This is working outport, not heritage village. The islands are bare rock and ocean. Trees do not grow here. The wind is constant. Why nobody visits? Ramea requires ferry commitment. The crossing takes an hour. The schedule limits day trips. The village has minimal visitor infrastructure. The consideration, Ramea is genuinely isolated. Ferry-dependent life is different life. Number 1, Francois sits on Newfoundland's south coast. Population 85. This outport is accessible only by boat. No road has ever reached here. No road ever will. The village sits in a narrow inlet surrounded by cliffs. Houses cling to the only flat land available. The cemetery is on a hill because there is no flat land large enough for both. Average house price, $85,000. A house sold recently for $79,000. Properties here are cheapest on our list because boat access limits demand. Francois is served by government ferry from Grey River. The ferry runs on schedule but reflects the reality of serving 85 people in a boat access location. The outport has school for the handful of children. The clinic operates on limited schedule with nurse rather than doctor. Walking Francois means understanding why outports exist. The harbor is protected. The fishing grounds are accessible. The isolation kept the culture alive. Why nobody visits? You cannot casually visit Francois. The ferry schedule requires planning. The village has no accommodation for visitors. The consideration, Francois represents outport life at its most authentic and most challenging. No road means everything arrives by boat. Medical emergencies mean boat evacuation. Weather controls everything. Francois takes the top spot because it represents Newfoundland outport culture in its purest form. No road, no tourists, no pretense, just a community that stayed when others left, that functions when economics say it should not. Conclusion. 8 outports, Grand Bru to Francois, populations from 0 to 500, each representing Newfoundland as it actually exists rather than as tourism presents it. These outports prove that isolation is not always negative. Sometimes being overlooked is protection. Sometimes boat access preserves what road access destroys. Newfoundland's real story is not in St. John's or Gros Morne. It is in outports where boats still matter, where fishing is identity, where isolation shaped culture that survived. For those seeking authentic Newfoundland, these 8 outports wait. Getting there requires commitment. Understanding them requires patience. But the reward is experiencing Canada as it existed before roads connected everything. Your